You don't want to waste your money and effort trying to, transform or digitize processes that really are not delivering value.
That was Kevin Jackson, one of my favorite experts on cloud computing and cybersecurity. And I'm your host, Kenton Williston, the editor-in-chief of insight.tech. I'll be talking with Kevin today about manufacturing infrastructure in the age of COVID-19. Before we get to the interview, I'd like to invite you to join Kevin and myself as we continue this conversation in our Twitter chat September 9. Just use the hashtag IoTDevChat to participate. Kevin, welcome to the show. What manufacturing issues have you been focused on lately?
First, Kenton, thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm really into IoT, but with respect to manufacturing, really all industries, it's all about digital transformation. Although the adoption of digital technology is really important for every industry vertical, manufacturing for some reason has really been slow to take up the challenge. I believe this is mostly because of the complexities driven by global supply chains, the tight schedules, and resource constraints. The unexpected, rapid, and extremely severe and widespread challenges presented by the global pandemic has forced them to reconsider everything. A particular interest of mine is about 5G capabilities, the ready push for Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, machine learning, and predictive analytics.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And I totally agree with you there. Industry has been relatively slow to adopt individually some of these technologies and at a higher level embrace this idea of digital transformation. And I think that's understandable. There's a lot of risk aversion here. I mean, generally speaking, factories, their key metric is uptime. You've got oftentimes really thin margins and you just got to keep things running. And it's difficult, to say the least, to justify, a huge change in direction and, taking your production lines down to do something totally new. But as you said, I think, the current context has given a lot of folks pause to reconsider that because there have been so many disruptions, both to the supply chains, like you mentioned, and even on the demand side, where there have been some very rapid swings in what consumers were looking for, and even business customers for that matter. And of course, things have calmed down. There's no shortages of toilet paper anymore, and that's a good thing. But I think there's still a lot of uncertainty in the manufacturing sector. There's still a lot of economic uncertainty. There's geopolitical instability. And that makes me wonder, what in the world manufacturers can do to survive and maybe even get a little bit ahead in this environment where there's just so much uncertainty.
Well, the supply chains are still in bad shape. I mean, I've recently heard about some manufacturer, a particular one I won't name, is stopping the availability of few of their products and announcing it won't be available until 2021. So manufacturers really need to recognize and in their heart accept that we are in an era of continuous and rapidly accelerating change. The standard operating processes and long-held norms that they have operated on for years need to be revamped and digitized. Companies also need to take a much broader view of their position in the industry value chain. It's not about an individual company anymore. It's really about the ecosystem, you and your suppliers, as well as your customers. Manufacturing executives need to build and nurture value-based ecosystems if they wish to compete in this ever-changing environment.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And, as you know, on our program, our insight.tech program, we've been covering a lot of these topics lately. Some just surreptitiously, not surreptitiously, serendipitously, slightly different idea. But we've been covering on our program, sometimes serendipitously and sometimes, post-pandemic to address these exact questions. the idea of having a more holistic view of your operations. So one example that comes to mind for me is we had a really interesting article we did with a company called Noodle.ai that was all about using AI technologies to have a more flexible and agile approach to managing your supply chain.
Yeah.
Like I said, kind of the old ways of doing things, often you'd have just kind of like a spreadsheet based approach to say, okay, we're going to need X number of pallets of this, and, we're going to have our maintenance crew out, Y number of times a month to keep them all on the equipment running and this sort of thing,
Right.
straightforward, regular process. Now it's like, well, when things are less predictable, we've got to think a little bit deeper into the ecosystem and, have a little bit more advanced planning, and also, on the short term, be able to really turn on a dime. But that's a lot to ask for, having that really deep view of your ecosystem, and also, really quick agility. That's tough. So what are some of the key technologies manufacturers should be looking at to enable that kind of flexibility that really hasn't been there before?
Yeah, you're right. It is hard. But from my point of view, the convergence of artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things on the manufacturing and assembly line are really introducing both opportunities and challenges to these companies. The blending will redefine the future of industrial automation, with IoT acting as sort of a digital nervous system and artificial intelligence becoming the brain that makes the overall control decisions. These intelligent and connected systems are capable of self-correcting, self-healing, and this innovation will drive unique processes that can enable these companies to establish competitive edge in their marketplace. And this is the only way they can survive if they expect to thrive.
For sure. And a couple examples, again, that come to mind for me there of what I've been seeing in this sector. So one, there's a company that we've been talking to called Innovance, and they had a really interesting case study that I was reading here just recently,
Hmm.
where they were using machine vision technology for QA, QC kind of purposes. And of course, that's a pretty useful technology in any context. But what made it really interesting in this example is, because they were, using machine trained models for this QA, QC kind of work. When the pandemic came along and they needed to repurpose their production lines very quickly, in this case, it was moving to production of N95 masks, which of course became a very important thing to have available to the world. They were able to take a production line that was doing completely different kinds of products and retrain the inspection equipment that was doing totally unrelated kind of inspection. It was able to retrain it for this new purpose very, very quickly and spin up that line. And another example that comes to mind, something that Kevin, you and I have worked together on, was a piece about a company called Reliometrics. Again, where
Right.
this was an example of electronics manufacturing, where these self-training systems are able to adapt to all kinds of different configurations, on the fly. So, again, rather than having to have a whole bunch of manual processes, you can maintain that high level of agility, very quickly adapt, and on a dime, produce a new product that you weren't doing before, or maybe even just a new variation of a product.
Yeah, absolutely. These companies need to understand, as I said before, change is constant. They need to always be thinking, what's next? What does my customer need? How can I deliver value to the ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, I think there's a kind of a deeper question here, which is, I mean, this all sounds great. Let's deploy all these really cool, cutting edge new technologies that can enable us, this incredible level of agility and visibility into everything that we're doing. But of course, the existing factory infrastructure doesn't necessarily lend itself well to that. If you look in sort of the typical manufacturing line, you often have a lot of equipment that's been there for years, may not
Hmm.
be connected to anything. It may not have any particular level of intelligence. It's just a basic piece of equipment that's doing the same task over and over, or maybe like a rotating piece of machinery that all it does is spin around and that's it. Very
Yeah.
simple, simple kinds of equipment and assets. So it seems to me like, before we even get into the conversation of like all the amazing things the IoT and AI can do for you, that there's an underlying question of how do you lay that basic foundation of the factory infrastructure in place to be able to support all of these new technologies. Where should manufacturers start there?
Well, first of all, they need to understand that some of the things they're doing right now that they've done for years have no value. They're doing it basically out of muscle memory. They need to re-examine their core business processes and the associated key metrics with those processes. The new IoT systems will need to collect, store, process, and analyze that data so that they can optimize the control of production line devices, robots, and autonomous vehicles. You don't want to waste your money and effort trying to, transform or digitize processes that really are not delivering value. The telemetry that the sensors on your manufacturing lines produce will be interpreted by artificial intelligence through the use of data visualizations, patterns, and correlations. These resulting AIoT systems will then proactively enhance operational efficiency. They'll be able to make accurate operational predictions and enable the humans to make more intelligent business decisions. This is not the way of the future. It's how companies, manufacturers are operating today. If you're not doing it right now, it's time to catch up.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And, I'm thinking about, again, the real fundamental baseline of the infrastructure. It seems like one of the key places to start is just getting all this equipment connected. And again, here I've seen lots and lots of recent examples that I think are pretty interesting and useful. So like we've done a lot of work on the insight.tech program to create some really interesting articles showcasing Cisco, for example, has done a lot of really interesting work in the connected factory space where um, you know, getting all these devices connected may not even necessarily mean running a lot of cabling around. It could all be wireless. And I know you're really into the 5G space, so I'm wondering if you tell me a little bit, kind of how you see, what's the starting point for just getting everything attached in the first place to the IoT?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned wireless because when people think about wireless, they look at wireless LANs, the existing wireless LANs, and they may say, okay, I already have that. I don't need any more. The problem there is the current wireless LANs don't have the bandwidth. They may not be able to transmit the large amount of data that these intelligent sensors on the shop floor will be sending. And if they did transmit the data, it would have high latency. So your robots will look like they're drunk. They won't be able to operate and do their jobs. So this is where the advantages of 5G will really enhance the floor. When people think about 5G, once again, they make an assumption it's just about their smartphone and it's just about wide area networking. That's not true. The small cell 5G technology is what's going to be put on these factory floors. So the manufacturers will need to replace their existing wireless networks with this 5G small cell technology. This will enable the high bandwidth within these localized areas. It would also bring edge computing capabilities right next to those assembly lines. This is how you can really leverage things like machine vision to enhance the quality and reduce the cost of manufacturing these products. The, the reduction in cost, enhanced quality will turn into your competitive advantage in the marketplace.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm glad you mentioned the element of edge computing. It seems to me like there's sort of two critical elements of getting, all of your operations instrumented so you can start taking advantage of this data. So one that we've been talking about is the network, and then the other, which you mentioned, was the edge computing. And I think, there have been so many developments in that area just in the last couple of years that have really changed what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking of, in particular, when it comes to computing platforms for AI and machine vision, there's really been a revolution both in the hardware capabilities and the software capabilities, so that you can really deploy an incredible amount of capabilities at the edge in a low cost, low power, highly reliable kind of platform. And I'm wondering what you're seeing, in that regard, like what's happening at the edge that might be surprising to manufacturers they may not be aware of right now.
Yeah, the most surprising thing is that your compute and your storage is no longer relegated to the data center. You think of a building with a lot of computers inside of it, and that's where all the magic's happening. Well, that's not true in edge computing. The actual infrastructure itself is all software. So the server is all software. It's actually referred to as infrastructure as software, right? So the compute capability, it's liberated from these physical buildings. It will travel across the 5G network and sit right there next to your assembly line so that it reduces the distance and latency required to do work. So it's a distributed cloud that enables this edge computing. And you may also have heard of fog computing, where all of these sensors are talking to one another, and the data is flowing back and forth, compute capabilities flying back and forth. One sensor may be using storage from another device. I mean, it is really, well, futuristic, but it's happening now and it's happening today. And think about uh, virtual reality and augmented reality. When the worker needs to go and fix a machine, they want to have the manual right there in front of them and with images overlaid onto the physical device and with the information as to how to fix it, what you should see. All of that is driven by this distributed computing architecture and edge computing.
Yeah, totally. It is amazing. I mean, it's just a totally different world that we're in right now, and it's the gap between how things have been done. Like I was describing earlier, where you may have just incredibly simplistic rotating machines that all they do is they spin. That's what they do.
Right.
To the now, which seems super futuristic, of the idea that you've got a data center is so outdated. Your data center really is kind of everywhere. The intelligence is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's an amazing jump. But having said that, I think there still is a really important role for the traditional data center and an important role even for public and hybrid clouds to play. And I think this is another place where manufacturers have been, again, understandably hesitant to get too far into it because there's reliability concerns, security concerns, which I think are absolutely legitimate. So I'm wondering, what do you see as the role of the cloud in these industrial environments, and what's been happening that can address these concerns around reliability, security, and all the rest?
Well, the foundation of all these advances is really cloud computing because that's what delivers the low-cost connectivity, storage, and compute resources. If security was a major impediment to cloud adoption, we wouldn't be seeing it deeply penetrate literally every industry. So that's really a red herring about the security and availability. Education is a cure to any security or availability concerns. Cloud transition failures are mostly caused by an insistence on pursuing an inappropriate use of cloud. This is trying to use cloud computing as you would use a traditional data center. I mean, one of the most prolific strategies for cloud is referred to as lift and shift, where you take the exact same architecture that you have in your data center and you just lift and shift it into a cloud environment. Although it's the most broadly adopted strategy, it's the absolute worst strategy because it doesn't leverage the capabilities of cloud. And those that have done this as an initial move, saying that, well, we'll get to modifying our applications at a later date, seem to never get there because they can never get the budget to modify their applications to take advantage of the software-based infrastructure. So it's important, it is critical to understand the business advantages of cloud and to redesign your business models and your IT to take advantage of those changes. I mean, cloud is not about IT. You're really, it's a model, right? It's actually five different models for consuming information technology. It's a different model of consuming information technology, different model for securing the data that's associated with that IT. It's a different model for acquiring the IT. The economic model is completely different. So all this drives different business models.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you there, and at risk of just becoming like buzzword soup. When I look at what all of the major cloud providers are doing, whether it's Google Cloud Platform or Microsoft Azure or
Hmm.
AWS, there's so much that's available that is radically different from how you would do things traditionally in the data center. I'm thinking of, again, all the buzzwords like microservices and DevOps,
Right,
all these sort of good things, but they really do present a radically different way of being able to deploy intelligence into the factory. And, a lot of these things even have specific features that are incredibly relevant for IoT sorts of applications, where you can, for example, develop these microservices in the cloud and then push them down to the edge. And then that's just a totally different way of thinking about how you do computation.
right. That's the mobility aspect. It's not just the humans that are mobile. All of the services um, across your IT environment are mobile. They act as components and modules that you can switch in and switch out based upon the service you're delivering, the customer you're serving, the location that you are, even the laws that apply. I mean, a lot of organizations are dealing with GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, um, which is, by the way, enforceable globally. So it's not just about European companies, it's about data. And your manufacturers need to think about the origin of the data, how it's being used, where the data is being uh, transformed and moved. If you recently heard about the High Court, the European ruling that Facebook has violated the privacy of European citizens by bringing their data to the United States and manipulating that data. And they now have actually said that Privacy Shield, which is the agreement between the United States and Europe on protecting data, is invalidated. Okay, so the manufacturers that are operating across the Atlantic, this affects their everyday operations. So you need to really be plugged in to how the management of data can affect your manufacturing line.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of tie this back up to where we started the conversation, I think these new approaches to manufacturing, i.e., using AIoT, the combination of AI and IoT technologies, moving towards a more wireless mobile kind of model for connecting and sharing data, moving to a more cloud-centric infrastructure of software model for how you manage your factory and across your production lines, across your suppliers. I think all of these new ways of doing business are really key to achieving that agility that's so critical right now when times are so uncertain. And I think right along with that, there's a need to adopt these sorts of technologies very quickly right now in order to respond to the environment that we're in right now. But at the same time, if I put myself in the shoes of a manufacturer, I'm going to be worried about, okay, this all sounds great to have a way to respond to the current context, but is this really going to work for me over the long term? So what can manufacturers do to both quickly transform their operations, but also ensure that they have a future-proof infrastructure?
Well, see, you sort of, like I say, hit the nail on the head right there. Things will change constantly. They first need to abandon an expectation of any type of long-term consistency. That's in the past. The pace of change is accelerating across all industries, and manufacturing isn't an exception. Continuous change is the norm. Survival will depend on an organization's ability to build their business ecosystems, innovate quickly, and deal with unexpected industry shocks like COVID.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I see we're getting close to the end of our time together.
Mhm.
Kevin, any closing thoughts you'd like to share with our audience?
Yes, the world is digital and virtual. In the manufacturing sector, that means 3D interactive modeling, virtual reality, augmented reality, training using those advanced technologies, additive manufacturing, and remote interactions. You have to know that's what's needed and plan on using it.
Very exciting. Well, I can't wait to see what happens next. And certainly, I hope we'll have a chance to chat again about all these topics, Kevin. But for now, I'll say thanks for joining us. And where can our listeners find you online?
Well, actually, I'm looking forward to the Twitter chat that's coming up, and it's really easy to find me online. If you on LinkedIn, just search for Kevin L. Jackson, or on Twitter, it's Kevin_Jackson. And absolutely, don't miss my articles on insight.tech.
All right, Kevin, thanks for the plugs. And like you said, the Twitter chat is coming up September 9 at 10 o'clock Pacific. And we'll be again talking about manufacturing infrastructure and would love to have you join us. Just use the hashtag IoTDevChat to participate. This has been the IoT Dev Chat podcast. If you enjoyed listening, please support us by subscribing and rating us on your favorite podcast app. We'll be back next time with more ideas from industry leaders at the forefront of IoT design.